It was just before dawn when Sister Clarisse's body was discovered sprawled beneath the ancient yew tree, blood soaking her habit and pooling in the frost-laden grass. Her glassy eyes stared blankly into the clouded sky. The sight sent a visceral shock through the convent grounds, a place presumed to be sanctified and insulated from the world's most wicked horrors. But there she lay, the picture of piety turned into a horrifying tableau of violence. No one screamed at first. Shock had stolen all capacity for voice. As footsteps skidded to a halt and nuns pressed shaking hands to their mouths, a single question crystallized in every mind. How could something like this happen in our midst? Welcome to Shocking True Crime Files. I'm thrilled to have you here for another captivating video. If you enjoy our content, please take a moment to subscribe, like, and share. Within the hour, the local police were on site, quietly combing through the grounds. The quiet hush of dawn gave way to a pointed hush of fear. Gossip fluttered from corridor to corridor, but the sisters did their best to remain outwardly calm, diligently reciting prayers and carrying out morning chores, even as they were weighed down by a sense of darkness that seemed to settle on every available surface. Some asked, with dread in their eyes, if this was an act of God's punishment or if it was the work of a malefactor who had penetrated the sacred cloister. But as the hours ticked by, whispers rose that perhaps the assailant was no outsider at all. For years, rumors had drifted around these halls, ephemeral like candle smoke. There were stories of jealousy, scandal, forbidden passions, and even quiet hatred simmering under starched wimples and neatly pressed habits. Yet none ever imagined that such rumors could culminate in bloodshed. The question that morning was not merely who had the capability to kill Sister Clarisse, but what could possibly motivate such a heinous crime inside a house of God? Before long, the investigating officers discovered something that turned the entire convent's world upside down. Sister Clarisse had not died alone. Locked away in a small chamber near the chapel was Sister Justine, barely alive, her face bruised and her habit torn. She was found unconscious on the cold stone floor, seemingly left to die. It was her moans that caught the attention of a young acolyte who stumbled upon the scene while searching for Sister Clarisse's Bible. Sister Justine was rushed to the hospital, her survival uncertain, and yet even from her fragile condition, she clung to life fiercely. It was in that moment that the investigating detective realized that the solution to this murder might hinge on Sister Justine's whispered words, if only she could find the strength to speak. Of course, she did, and those words, half delirious but searing in their detail, introduced a scandal so epic that for a time, it threatened to tear down the entire convent. Two nuns, bound by vows to God, found themselves entangled in a secret love affair. And not just any love affair. One that bristled with hidden betrayals, blackmail, and a grand deception that laid a sinister pathway to murder. Sister Justine spoke of clandestine nighttime meetings, coded notes, and stolen kisses amid the shadows of the confessional. She begged the detective to understand. Love had not destroyed them. It was something deeper, more sinister. The detective's notebook shook in her hands, the gravity of each revelation compelling her to pry further. Yet every piece of evidence raised 1,000 new questions. What could have driven the two nuns to hide a relationship of such intensity? How did their devotion to God collide with their desire for each other? Could the secret of their shared love alone lead to a crime so brutal? Or was there a more complex motive lurking in the gloom? And so begins the case we are looking at today, a case whose roots were tangled in lust, fear, and fanatical religiosity, a labyrinth of moral and emotional corruption that would ultimately claim more than one life before it was finished. To truly understand the tragedy that befell Sister Clarisse and the entire convent, it's necessary to trace the faint outlines of her history. Born Martha Jean Tillman to a devout Catholic family, she took her final vows at the tender age of 21. From day one, her sincerity was unquestionable. She was the type of nun who would kneel in the chapel for hours, her head bowed in fervent prayer. Yet beneath that pious exterior, Sister Clarisse carried burdens no one else could see. She joined the convent seeking refuge from a world she felt had grown too dark, too unkind. In the hush of the cloister, she hoped to find a love that transcended human betrayal. She found that love and faith, or so everyone believed, but faith could not extinguish her human longings. By the time Sister Clarisse turned 25, fleeting glances from other nuns ignited something within her. Curiosities about life, desire, and eventually, intimacy. Of all the potential acquaintances in that small community, it was Sister Justine who enraptured her heart. 5 years younger, Sister Justine was a striking figure, tall, with watchful blue eyes and a quiet air that radiated warmth. She, too, had her scars from a life before the convent, though she rarely spoke of them. Drawn by each other's silent grief, they formed a friendship that blossomed in the quiet corners of the chapel. The daily rhythms of convent life meant early morning prayers, silent reflection, communal chores, and the unwavering contemplation of sacred texts. And yet, in this disciplined routine, Sister Clarisse found ways to catch Sister Justine's eye, to offer her a comforting squeeze of the hand, to share a private smile. At first, these gestures seemed harmless, acts of companionship in a place where typical expressions of affection were subdued. But somewhere along the line, comfort grew into fascination, and fascination tilted toward obsession. Long, hushed conversations after compliment evolved into lingering touches that pulsed with longing. And so, the seeds of desire took root in the most unlikely of gardens. In the early stages, neither Sister Clarisse nor Sister Justine dared breathe a word of their attraction, not even to each other. They buried it under layers of denial and deeper devotion to daily prayers. Each sister fought her own internal battle, torn between her vow to God and a powerful yearning she had never before encountered with such intensity. Their unspoken desperation fueled secret notes, hidden behind hymnals or tucked under half-burnt candles, cryptic messages that read like confessions of a guilt-ridden heart. "Your eyes speak truths I cannot deny," Sister Clarisse once wrote. Sister Justine wrote back, "I see you, I feel you, and yet I cannot be with you. Pray for me." As the months passed, the two women recognized that prayer alone couldn't quell their growing closeness. They began meeting in the hush of midnight, when the moonlight streamed through stained glass windows to cast haunting shapes on the chapel floor. There, among flickering candles and the lingering scent of incense, they would sit side by side, hearts pounding as each longed to close the distance between them. Sometimes, their conversation circled back to Scripture, as if reminding themselves why they were here. Other times, the silence said it all. One night, Sister Clarisse dared to graze Sister Justine's fingers. It was an electric moment, one that irrevocably changed the dynamic between them. What followed was a slow dance of stolen intimacy. Soft kisses behind pillars, tender embraces under the cloak of darkness, careful enough not to alert the watchful eyes of older nuns who patrolled the corridors. In these moments, they shared stories of childhood, heartbreak, and the reasons they each sought refuge in the convent. With every word and every touch, they built a hidden world just for themselves, one that felt even more sacred than their religious devotion. But guilt gnawed at them. The sense of sin overshadowed their happiness, turning each secret tryst into an anguished paradox. The deeper their love, the greater their guilt, and the more fervently they prayed for guidance they secretly hoped would never arrive. Human relationships are seldom as secret as we imagine. Within the tightly knit world of the convent, rumors spread like wildfire. Idle remarks over laundry or mealtime whispers were enough to fan speculation. It began innocently, with Sister Agnes commenting on how Sister Clarisse and Sister Justine seemed unusually close. Another nun noted they often left prayers together. By the time this rumor mill gathered momentum, it expanded into wild speculation about unholy attachments, unnatural affections, and the possibility that these two were violating their vows in ways far beyond mild infractions. In a strict environment where any breach of discipline could lead to severe consequences, real or imagined threats loomed. The higher-ranking sisters, those who had walked these corridors for decades, were not naive. They had witnessed small transgressions before, but this time, the air felt different. A hush of scandal circled overhead like a vulture. The older nuns, especially the formidable Sister Superior Bernadette, gave the pair stern looks. An unspoken warning vibrated through each silent glance. If you have secrets, they will be unearthed. Fear coiled around Sister Clarisse's heart. She was convinced that if they discovered the truth, both she and Sister Justine would be cast out, spiritually damned and physically exiled. The emotional stakes had never been higher. That fear found a tangible shape in the form of an anonymous letter slipped beneath Sister Justine's door. The letter was simple but menacing: confess or suffer the consequences. No name was signed, no clue given as to the sender's identity. Alarmed, Sister Justine shared it with Sister Clarisse, her hands trembling. They decided to keep their heads down, to be more careful. But as the days passed, more letters arrived. A cryptic phrase scribbled in the margin of one note read, "Sanctified hearts do not beat with desire." Another threatened, "The wages of sin will consume you." Each letter ratcheted their anxiety to feverish levels. In a desperate moment, Sister Clarisse confided in a friend, Sister Harriet. Harriet was known for her gentle demeanor and encouraging nature. She listened quietly as Sister Clarisse recounted the letters and the mounting fear. Harriet offered comfort, saying she would do everything possible to protect them from scandal. But Harriet also warned her, never underestimate the capacity for hidden malice within sacred walls. Sister Clarisse recalled Harriet's words many times in the following weeks, especially when the blackmail took a more dangerous turn. A final note arrived, stating, "I want something in return for my silence." The message was clear. The blackmailer wanted money, or else. But who among them would stoop so low? Sister Justine was frantic. They had no real source of personal income. Whatever meager earnings they had belonged to the convent. Perhaps they could steal from the donation box, but the very thought turned Sister Clarisse pale. It was unthinkable to rob the faithful who supported their mission. Yet the alternative was also horrifying. Exposure, disgrace, and a fate that could ruin them both. Desperate times propelled them toward desperate acts. Though it went against every principle they held sacred, the two women decided that paying the blackmailer might be their only option, at least until they figured out the perpetrator's identity. But even as they planned how to gather the funds, a new twist surfaced. Sister Justine discovered a hidden note in the library, pinned beneath a statue of the Virgin Mary. It read, "Meet me alone in the confessional at midnight." No further details. Fear gripped Sister Justine. Was this the blackmailer's trap? An opportunity to reveal them to the entire convent? Yet it was also a chance to confront this unknown tormentor and plead for mercy. Sister Clarisse insisted that she herself go in place of Sister Justine. But Sister Justine refused, suspecting that her presence alone had been requested for a dark reason. Against her better judgment, Sister Justine prepared to meet the blackmailer under cover of darkness. That night, the chapel was bathed in moonlight. Shadows danced among the pews, lending an eerie hush to the solemn space. With each step toward the confessional, Sister Justine's heart hammered. She thought about Sister Clarisse, waiting anxiously in their cell, praying for a safe return. When Sister Justine slipped inside the confessional, the door on the other side rattled. Breaths were held. In a low voice, masked by the wooden lattice, the blackmailer demanded that Sister Justine remain silent. A whispered command, "Place the money in the poor box tomorrow morning, or everyone will know what you and Clarisse have done." Sister Justine tried to peer through the lattice, but the blackmailer had cleverly obscured their face with a thick hood. But then the voice threatened something even more chilling. "If you don't comply, Sister Clarisse will suffer dearly." A wave of dread overtook Sister Justine. She managed to murmur, "Who are you? Why do this?" But silence followed. The other confessional door opened, and footsteps faded away. Sister Justine emerged trembling, aware she had just stepped deeper into a dangerous quagmire. She couldn't let Sister Clarisse become a target. Whatever guilt weighed upon her, she concluded the money had to be delivered. Yet she also vowed to uncover the blackmailer's identity, no matter the cost. In their cell that night, Sister Justine told Sister Clarisse about the threat. Clarisse's face went ashen. She whispered, "We'll do whatever is necessary to protect ourselves. I can't bear the thought of losing you." With that, they knelt together to pray. But their prayers for salvation were tinged with desperation and confusion, for they felt trapped in a moral labyrinth. Sin had led them here, but sin might also be their only means of escape. And overshadowing it all was the blackmailer, an invisible puppet master controlling their fates. The next morning, Sister Justine, trembling with every step, crept to the poor box and slipped in a sealed envelope filled with what little money they could scrape together from personal allowances and a few valuables Sister Clarisse had managed to acquire before joining the convent. The entire time, Sister Justine's senses were on high alert, searching for anyone who might be watching. A wave of nausea rolled through her as she realized how truly precarious their situation had become. By paying off a blackmailer, they had broken their vows of honesty and integrity even further, though it seemed a lesser evil than the threat of total ruin. But the blackmailer's appetite only grew. Within days, another letter arrived. "I want more." The ultimatum was clear. The sense of impending doom escalated. Sister Clarisse felt backed into a corner. They had no more valuables, no access to further money. They were, in effect, powerless. Whispers of their rumored relationship continued to swirl in the convent. In the refectory, Sister Bernadette eyed them both with a suspicion as cold as the stone walls. Sister Harriet, noticing the deepening pallor of Sister Clarisse, suggested she see the convent's visiting physician. A swirl of dread circled Sister Clarisse and Sister Justine constantly. Sleep became scarce. Their once tender romance turned into a shared terror. Then came an unlikely reprieve. Father Gabriel, a priest from a neighboring parish, visited to conduct a spiritual retreat. He was known for his compassionate ear, and Sister Clarisse seized the chance to pour out her heart in the secrecy of confession. She stopped short of naming names or revealing specifics, but she explained that she felt ensnared in mortal sin and blackmail. The priest's counsel was gentle yet firm. Sin thrives in darkness. You must bring it into the light, or it will destroy you. But how could she do that when exposing their relationship meant losing everything? The conflict tore at her soul. After Father Gabriel departed, Sister Clarisse experienced a flicker of determination. Perhaps, she reasoned, they could reveal their plight to Sister Harriet, whom she trusted, and strategize a way out. But when she approached Sister Harriet's cell the next day, Harriet was nowhere to be found. Instead, she noticed a slip of paper jutting from Harriet's desk drawer. It was another blackmail letter. Sister Clarisse's stomach lurched as she read the same menacing language that had haunted her dreams. Harriet was the blackmailer. The gentle, comforting friend who had given her words of warning was, in fact, the orchestrator of their torment. Horrified, Sister Clarisse realized Harriet had access to all the secrets from her confidences. Perhaps Harriet's facade of kindness had been a ploy to glean more information, ensuring the blackmail scheme's success. Rage and betrayal flared within Sister Clarisse. She hurried back to Sister Justine, hands trembling, to reveal her discovery. Sister Justine was equally shocked, recalling Harriet's soft-spoken reassurances. How could this be? Why would Harriet stoop to such cruelty? They speculated about Harriet's motives. Envy, a thirst for control, a hidden debt. But no matter the reason, Harriet's betrayal meant they were in more danger than ever. Fueled by a mix of fear and defiance, Sister Clarisse insisted they confront Harriet. That night, they navigated the dimly lit corridors, hearts hammering, until they reached Harriet's small office near the novices' dormitory. Finding the door unlocked, they slipped inside. Harriet stood at her desk, her eyes wide with shock as they burst in. Sister Justine wasted no time demanding an explanation. Harriet's expression twisted between guilt and indignation. She didn't deny the letters, but she refused to explain fully. All she muttered was that they had violated God's laws, and she was punishing them for their own good. The notion that Harriet considered blackmail a righteous act chilled their very souls. Sister Clarisse clenched her jaw. "We loved each other," she said, tears clouding her eyes, "and we meant no harm." But Harriet's cruelty revealed itself in her smirk. "No harm? You defied everything this convent stands for. If you cannot atone, you must suffer." Sister Justine tried to reason with Harriet, but Harriet threatened to expose them if they didn't continue paying. Then Harriet pulled out a small knife from her desk drawer, brandishing it in a trembling hand. A taut silence filled the tiny room as Harriet hissed, "You think this is the worst I can do? Keep defying me, and you'll find out." Fearful for their lives, Sister Justine and Sister Clarisse backed out and fled down the corridor. Harriet's laughter followed them, like a menacing echo. They locked themselves in their cell, hearts pounding, and debated their next move. Reporting Harriet to Sister Superior Bernadette seemed futile. Harriet had manipulated enough evidence to twist the story any way she pleased. And considering Harriet had a weapon, direct confrontation was too dangerous. The only solace they found that night was in clinging to each other, trembling under the thin blanket, as darkness weighed down on the convent walls like a foreboding omen. In the following days, Harriet's behavior grew more erratic. She prowled the halls with dark circles under her eyes, a perpetual sneer on her lips. She cornered Sister Clarisse in the library one morning, whispering that the devil must be exorcised from her soul, while brandishing that same small knife in a manner that made Sister Clarisse's blood run cold. Harriet demanded more money, more contrition, and Sister Clarisse realized with dread that Harriet's obsession was not merely about profit. It was about power. Harriet wanted to see them broken. Desperate, Sister Justine suggested they run away. But where could they go? They had pledged their lives to the church, and forging a life outside seemed impossible. More importantly, Sister Justine still clung to a sliver of hope for redemption. But Harriet's unpredictable behavior demanded immediate action. Sister Clarisse and Sister Justine began logging Harriet's actions in a journal, detailing each threat, each extortion attempt. Their plan was to gather enough evidence so that, if it came to a showdown, they could defend themselves, even if it meant risking the revelation of their forbidden love. Then, late one night, Sister Clarisse awakened to a faint noise in the corridor. She slipped out of bed, urging Sister Justine to wait behind while she investigated. The corridor was vacant, a flickering lantern casting dancing shadows on the walls. Suddenly, a figure lunged from a side passage, grabbing Sister Clarisse by the arm. Harriet's face loomed, twisted with rage. Harriet hissed, "You think I haven't noticed your little notes? Your attempts to catch me?" Harriet brandished her knife, the metal gleaming ominously. Sister Clarisse tried to break free, but Harriet's grip was surprisingly strong. Fear scrambled Sister Clarisse's senses. Summoning courage, she managed to scream. That scream alerted Sister Justine, who burst from the cell, only to find Harriet pressing Sister Clarisse against the wall. Harriet's eyes, wild and frenzied, flicked over to Justine as if sizing up whether she could take them both. The tension cracked like a thunderbolt. Sister Justine lunged for Harriet's arm. In the ensuing struggle, Harriet slashed the blade wildly, slicing Sister Clarisse's forearm and drawing a thin line of blood. But Sister Justine managed to wrestle Harriet away. Harriet broke free, hissing like a cornered animal, and sprinted down the corridor. As Sister Clarisse sank to the floor, trembling and holding her bleeding arm, Sister Justine knelt beside her, tears streaming down her face. They knew Harriet had gone far beyond blackmail. She was prepared to kill. No one else in the convent stirred during that harrowing encounter. Morning arrived with pastel skies, and Sister Clarisse, her arm bandaged, insisted they seek help from Sister Superior Bernadette. But their fervent pleas fell on skeptical ears. Harriet had already approached Bernadette, spinning a tale of how Sister Clarisse and Sister Justine threatened her, trying to shift blame onto Harriet for reasons of shame and guilt. Sister Bernadette, deeply disturbed by the rumor of the nuns' sinful relationship, was predisposed to doubt them. She dismissed the pair brusquely, insisting that she would not tolerate wild accusations and attempts to deflect from your own wrongdoing. The injustice stung like salt in a wound. The sense of betrayal festered. Sister Clarisse, once devout in her faith, felt that God had turned his back on her. How else to explain such cruelty within these hallowed walls? Sister Justine watched helplessly as Clarisse's spiritual devotion crumbled beneath the weight of scandal and violence. Yet, ironically, this crisis also rekindled the fierce love between them, forging a deeper bond. They realized they were truly all each other had in this pit of betrayal. That night, as the convent bells tolled, they embraced in their cell, tears mingling with silent prayers that somehow they could find a way out of Harriet's snare. Things came to a head just a week later. The tension had grown so thick that many of the younger nuns tiptoed around the corridors, sensing a malefic presence that coiled in the air. Harriet's watchful gaze seemed to follow Sister Clarisse and Sister Justine everywhere. But Harriet made no immediate move, which only heightened their anxiety. The quiet calm before a storm is sometimes the most terrifying. Meanwhile, Sister Superior Bernadette had grown increasingly troubled by the swirling rumors. She decided to meet privately with Harriet to delve into the conflicting stories. An uneasy hush settled over the convent as the meeting took place behind closed doors. No one knew exactly what was said, but from Sister Bernadette's grim expression afterward, it was evident that Harriet had doubled down on her accusations, painting the relationship between Clarisse and Justine in lurid, damning colors. "They are lost in sin," Harriet had likely pronounced, "and now they blame me for their moral failings." The final straw came when Sister Bernadette summoned Sister Clarisse and Sister Justine, commanding them to perform penance for their alleged sins, a day of silent vigil in the oratory, kneeling in prayer and meditation. If they refused, they would face immediate expulsion. Resigned to their fate, Sister Clarisse and Sister Justine complied. They locked themselves in the oratory, kneeling on the cold marble floor, reciting rosaries for hours. Candles flickered, the golden icons around them seemed to watch with impassive eyes, and their knees ached. In that silent entombment, they wrestled with a tumult of emotion: regret, fear, anger, and an unwavering devotion for each other. Night fell, and still they prayed, determined to hold on to each other if nothing else. Their whispered confessions to each other were heartbreakingly tender. Sister Clarisse brushed her fingers across Sister Justine's cheek, promising that once dawn broke, they would find a way to escape the convent altogether if it meant saving their lives. But dawn arrived with a cruelty none could have foreseen. Harriet crept into the oratory while the rest of the convent was still in deep slumber. She carried a long, thin blade, her eyes gleaming with a twisted righteousness. Some corner of Harriet's mind likely believed she was enacting God's will, purging sin from the convent. As Sister Clarisse looked up from her vigil, she saw Harriet's silhouette blocking the oratory door. Before she could cry out, Harriet lunged. Sister Justine, sensing danger, moved to intercept, but Harriet slashed at her, slicing her side. Sister Justine collapsed, gasping in pain. Sister Clarisse screamed, the sound echoing off the vaulted ceiling. She grabbed a heavy candlestick from the altar and swung, catching Harriet's shoulder. Harriet stumbled, but her fury propelled her onward. She swung the blade wildly, catching Sister Clarisse in the chest. Clarisse staggered backward, her vision swimming. The blow was not immediately fatal, but the pain seized her entire body. Harriet advanced again. In a last desperate act, Sister Justine mustered what strength she could, wrapping her arms around Harriet's torso from behind, wrestling her to the floor. The blade clattered away, echoing in the hush of the oratory. Gasping, Harriet clawed at Sister Justine. Clarisse collapsed to her knees, blood pooling beneath her, her breath coming in weak, rattling gasps. Harriet's strength was unnerving, and Sister Justine found her own injuries slowing her down. Summoning a burst of adrenaline, Justine pinned Harriet's arms to the floor and screamed for help. Harriet spat curses, shrieking that the devil had possessed them. The commotion roused several nuns who rushed to the oratory. The scene was chaos. Sister Clarisse lying motionless in a pool of blood, Harriet thrashing beneath Sister Justine. When Sister Bernadette arrived, she stood aghast, her eyes flicking between the victim, the attacker, and the trembling Justine. The final image that all would remember was Sister Clarisse's last look of wide-eyed agony. Her lips formed a prayer, perhaps for deliverance or for Sister Justine's safety. Her blood stained the marble floor in a crimson circle, and then her head tilted, her last breath whispering away. The hush that followed was horrifying. Harriet's shrieks were the only sound, echoing off the silent walls. Sister Clarisse's eyes remained open, reflecting a sorrow that words can hardly describe. In the weeks following, the convent was in uproar. The police arrived, investigators in tow, interviewing everyone about Harriet's role in the blackmail and murder. Sister Justine, traumatized and injured, was taken to the local hospital for emergency surgery on her side. She survived but was left physically and emotionally scarred. Harriet was arrested, charged with murder, attempted murder, and blackmail. She appeared almost serene in her initial arraignment, claiming she was fulfilling a divine mandate to purge sin. The newspapers latched onto the story, sensationalizing the murderous nun in gruesome headlines. Sister Bernadette's leadership came under scrutiny. How had she missed the glaring warning signs? The diocese launched an internal investigation into the scandal, and donors withdrew their support from the convent. The older nuns, hearts heavy with grief and shame, locked themselves in near constant prayer for penance. The novices, frightened and disillusioned, questioned their place in this institution. Some left entirely, too shaken to continue their vocations. The entire ecclesiastical community struggled to make sense of the unthinkable tragedy that had occurred in a place that was supposed to be a sanctuary of love and faith. Through it all, Sister Justine grappled with crushing guilt. She told detectives the entire sordid story, how the affair began, the blackmail notes, Harriet's threats, and their failed attempts to escape the cycle of extortion. The detective in charge was initially stunned by the revelations but became deeply sympathetic toward Justine, realizing she, too, was a victim. Nonetheless, the courts demanded clarity. Harriet's trial showcased the darkest side of religiosity, twisted justifications for cruelty. She claimed Sister Clarisse and Sister Justine were possessed by lust and that her extreme actions were to redeem them. Psychiatric evaluations suggested Harriet herself was unstable, harboring a long history of suppressed rage and envy. When Sister Justine finally mustered the strength to visit Sister Clarisse's grave, a quiet slope behind the old orchard, She brought a single white rose. It was all she could afford, emotionally and otherwise. She knelt at the simple headstone, tears slipping down her cheeks as the wind rustled the orchard trees. Memories washed over her. Their stolen kisses in the chapel, their whispered confessions, and that last, terrified look in Clarisse's eyes. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice shaking. "You deserve so much more." For hours, she stayed there, the mountain of sorrow pressing down on her chest. The convent itself never quite recovered. A few older nuns endeavored to restore a sense of normalcy, but the scandal was too great. Harriet's conviction for murder sealed the convent's fate. She received life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The diocese decided to close the convent a year later, citing a need to reflect and rebuild. Rumors circulated that the grounds were cursed, an exaggeration, perhaps, but it underscored the lingering dread associated with the site. The building was eventually sold to a private buyer who intended to renovate it into a historical inn, but locals still whispered about the tragedy that had stained its floors. Meanwhile, Sister Justine chose not to remain in religious life. With Clarisse gone, the essence of faith she once clung to felt irrevocably shattered. She parted ways with the church, leaving behind the black habit that had once been her refuge. The world outside the cloister was intimidating, but she was determined to find a semblance of peace, if not redemption. She found a small apartment in a neighboring town, taking on work at a charitable shelter for battered women. In helping others in distress, she found a tenuous sense of purpose and a way to channel her grief. For a while, Sister Justine, who now went by her birth name, Angela, managed to navigate life's hardships. She attended therapy, which helped her come to terms with the trauma, at least to a degree. The ghost of Sister Clarisse lingered in her mind, an ever-present companion in her dreams. She avoided forming any close relationships, fearful of inviting heartbreak again. But she also discovered small joys, like volunteering at a soup kitchen and reading to elderly residents at a local hospice. Slowly, she felt tiny rays of hope pierce the darkness. But grief is a tricky specter. It can quiet down, but it never truly disappears. Some days, Angela found herself numb, hollowed by sadness so deep she felt physically ill. She kept Clarisse's rosary in a small wooden box next to her bed, occasionally holding it in her hands as a talisman of a love forever lost. She visited Clarisse's grave once a month, dutifully placing a fresh rose. Over time, the orchard grew unkempt, weeds sprouting between tombstones. But Angela's devotion never wavered. She would speak to Clarisse in hushed tones, updating her on life's mundane details. "I got a new job," or "I'm still missing you." Then, one cold winter morning, Angela didn't show up for her usual volunteer shift at the shelter. Concerned staff called her apartment multiple times. No answer. A social worker drove to her place, only to find her door locked and no response to knocks. With growing alarm, they contacted the police for a wellness check. When the officers finally gained entry, they found Angela's body slumped in a chair by the window, a single white rose resting in her lap. The final shock, a bottle of prescription medication lay empty on the table beside a note addressed to Sister Clarisse. The note was heart-wrenchingly simple. "I'm tired. I can't live in a world without you." Angela had chosen to end her life, to reunite, if only in some spiritual sense, with the woman who once illuminated her days. The sadness of that final act tore through the local community, especially those who knew her story. After surviving so much, after fighting for her life and her freedom, Angela succumbed to the despair that had haunted her all along. No one saw it coming, not her therapist, not her friends, not the shelter staff who had witnessed her unwavering dedication to others. In the end, the tragedy that began with a scandalous relationship and escalated to murder claimed one final victim. News of Angela's death traveled quickly, reawakening the sorrowful memory of Sister Clarisse's murder. Reporters wrote follow-up pieces recounting the entire saga with renewed sensationalism, tragedy upon tragedy in one love affair. Yet behind the lurid headlines lay an undercurrent of empathy. Some recognized the enormous pain these women had suffered under an institution that offered no space for their love or their struggles. Others blamed Harriet entirely, her cruelty setting in motion a chain reaction that ended in 2 lives lost and countless spirits broken. At Harriet's prison, the warden informed her of Angela's death. Harriet's reaction was reportedly devoid of emotion. She simply stared for a moment, then said, God's judgment is final. Whether her words implied condemnation or pity remained unclear. Harriet remained behind bars, her mind still twisted in justifications for her atrocity. She was never granted parole, nor did she appear to seek redemption. Some wondered if Harriet would ever comprehend the devastation her actions had unleashed on so many lives. Yet Harriet's understanding of guilt seemed to be overshadowed by a dogmatic fervor that permitted no introspection. Please like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more gripping true crime tales and shocking twists you won't believe. Your support makes a difference.